Chances are you've heard this claim that Jesus never existed, that he wasn't a real historic figure. But did you know when it comes to the experts in their field, the scholars and the historians, whether they're agnostic or atheist or Christian, there's almost universal agreement among them that Jesus certainly existed. This is because there's overwhelming evidence for Jesus' existence.
This is technically not true. It's not because there's overwhelming evidence. It's because the scholars in relevant fields for this particular question are primarily Christian and are mostly controlled by statements of faith. In David Fitzgerald's most recent book, Jesus, Mything in Action, he lays out a pretty rock-solid case for exactly how many of these degree-granting institutions that are relevant to this particular question are controlled by statements of faith. A good number of them just simply refuse to even take part in the study because they were controlled by statements of faith. In the book, David shows how even prestigious universities like Harvard would reject somebody for a professorship just because they didn't toe the Christian line. So this is an issue that permeates New Testament studies in general. And Christian apologists like Evan here want to make it out to be like it's primarily historians that are tackling this particular topic, but really it's New Testament scholars. They are sort of tangentially related to historical studies, but they themselves are not historians. That's not to say that their degree in New Testament studies isn't relevant to this question. It totally is. Another thing is that they always like to bring up agnostic and atheist scholars that agree that Jesus existed. While I do agree that New Testament studies and historians do have some agnostic and atheist scholars that agree that Jesus existed, the number of scholars that agree with mythicism or are agnostic on this idea that Jesus existed in history is growing. But if you were to take away the atheist and agnostic scholars from this pool of scholars he's talking about, the vast majority, overwhelmingly so, are Christian scholars that are controlled by statements of faith. So when he says that the evidence overwhelmingly supports that Jesus existed in history, this is evidence that's put forward by Christian scholars controlled by statements of faith, and that as a vast majority of New Testament scholarship controls the rest of New Testament scholarship. Just listen to John W. Loftus talking about why he held back his opinion on this particular subject for so long.
Now, to do my job effectively as a debunker, I can't be seen as a crank. But that was my modus operandi. I didn't want to be seen as a crank to those I wanted to reach. I must meet them on some common ground, the believers, the Christians. To come out as a mythicist early on would have been counterproductive, I think, for two reasons. One, because they think that's a crank position, and two, things have not progressed with mythicist studies as far as they have to this day. Well, now that I've established myself enough that Christians don't take me as a crank, I am at the position in my life saying what I think. And that just recently actually dawned on me. At what point can we say all traces of any real Jesus are gone, and that they're gone because he never existed as a real person in the first place? We have to work with what we have, not what we hope will be discovered in the future. So what do we have? And what can we conclude now? We can conclude that whatever traces of a human being we might find behind the ancient tales of Jesus, at best, they are indistinguishable from him not existing at all.
The fear of backlash in the New Testament scholarly community is so great that it even affects atheist and agnostic scholars. So no, I don't think that there's a vast amount of evidence that supports his existence. I think that there's just a vast number of Christians that don't even want to discuss this subject.
Now the question is, does it matter if our sources for Jesus are Christian or non-Christian? I had a high school student ask me once, are there any sources for Jesus outside of the Bible? I replied, why do they have to be outside of the Bible? And while she didn't have a response, I think I can take a guess. It's because skeptics don't trust the Bible, so of course they want their sources for Jesus to be outside of Scripture.
Well, yes, that would be nice, because obviously any book that's contained within the collection of books known as the Bible, they would have a bias. But that doesn't preclude them from being a good reference for a historical Jesus. Like, for instance, I think that the only author in the Bible that we can really use in this particular context is Paul. The Gospels come much later and are based on the teachings of Paul, as well as Christians that existed well before the Gospels were written down. If by the Bible you mean the Gospels, then yes, we can't trust those. But if you want to take the books of the Bible individually and use just the authentic letters of Paul, then we can build a picture of what these first Jewish Christians were like. Personally, I find Paul to be the best hope for a historical Jesus that historicists have. But the problem is, I think that the arguments for Paul considering Jesus to only ever be celestial are vastly stronger than the arguments for Paul saying that Jesus existed historically on earth.
And before we step into that territory of using non-Christian sources to prove Jesus, I first want to show in this video that the Gospels and other Christian writings are reliable historical documents to prove Jesus' existence.
Oh, awesome. I'm glad that you're going to try to establish them as reliable historical documents. I really don't think that you can include all the Gospels in this, because obviously all the Gospels aren't reliable historical documents. I think the best that you could probably say is that Mark is the closest thing to history, even though it still has a lot of magical elements to it. This isn't all that different from other historians at the time that were writing down things. I mean, you've got various authors reporting very magical things, and they were non-Christian historians that were actually keeping track of history rather than writing this theological narrative about Jesus. But my point is that you could definitely use Mark in order to try and build a case that they're at least based on some kind of historical story or historical tradition about Jesus. So, I mean, I'm willing to go that far for the sake of this particular argument. I don't think that that's the route he's going to take, but let's see what he does with the Gospels.